we're just going to explore the early days. You're going to tell me about the early days and how things kind of came to fruition.
Yeah, sure. Well, I got involved pretty early on just as a subscriber. The Seattle has I think the longest running regional astrology conference in the nation. It's NORWAC, and the '93 NORWAC. Rob Hand was the keynote speaker for the final night, and during that he announced the founding of Project Hindsight to great acclaim. I guess probably the subject of his talk had to do with retrieval of ancient texts. So, but the year after that, '94, was the first year that I had gone to any astrology conference. I had been studying astrology on my own off and on for 20 years, but I guess I owe it to my wife who urged me to. Well, she said that you're really good at this stuff. You should hang your shingle out, as they say. And I, being self-taught, I always felt there were things that holes in my knowledge. And so the conference with all of their published famous astrologers, they're giving classes. It seemed like a good place to start. And Bob Schmidt was manning a trade show booth for Project Hindsight, and I was an easy sell. It seemed a worthwhile project for not a lot of money to sign up to these monthly translations they were planning. But that summer, Ellen put together a conference, or a conclave, as she called it, against all the common wisdom of everybody that ever planned a conference. There's no way you can put on something of that short a notice, but by endless hours on the telephone and personally recruiting. I was actually rather flattered that she spent the time to call me to tell me, you have to come to this, you have to come to this. And it was really a remarkable event, kind of the astrological Woodstock of this era. Anybody who was there will know what I'm talking about. It was, for me, one of the big challenges or the questions I had with astrology had to do with house systems. And it was during that Bob suggested that I look at the whole sign houses, and it's a 20-year-old problem for me, and to find a house system that worked for my own chart was very exciting. Anyhow, I eagerly awaited all of the translations, and Bob had started doing a series of lectures on various philosophical subjects at his house. Unfortunately, being on the West Coast, I couldn't attend. But every time one came out, my job at the time gave me a lot of free time. I was running a camera at a racetrack, so every 5 minutes I'm following the horses around in a circle, and then the next 25 minutes I'm, sitting out there doing not much of anything. But in this case, it was listening to the lectures. But I remember in the early days, Bob came into the whole venture in a sideways way. He never really particularly been interested in astrology. He wasn't, opposed to it or anything. His wife Ellen was interested in it, but just his background was mathematical physics and things of the sort. But and philosophy was his main thing. And since he had a good knowledge of Greek, he was excited about the prospect of translating these old documents, because in the past, whenever the Greek material had come to light in a given culture and been translated, it sparked a renaissance. I mean, it did in the Arabic world, and without the rather marvelous flowering of scholarship and arts that happened under the first couple of caliphates, it wouldn't have been the material for the European Renaissance. So the astrological material represented the last trove of unplumbed material. It was often described as the trash heap of history. So he was convinced that there were things of value to be found in it, not specifically so much having to do with the astrology, but having to do with the conceptual problems that were being worked at in science at the time. And he had the notion that there was an unrepresented school of philosophy that was hidden in these works, because both Plato and Aristotle, with their view of science, something like astrology isn't even a subject that's fit for scientific inquiry. So the fact that this Greek astrology was proposing to do exactly that, to explain why I have no children, but my brother has 5, to him, either there's a foreign philosophical school, probably something from the Near East that was, a wolf in sheep's clothing that snuck into the field somehow, or else a genuinely unrecognized Greek philosophical school. So that was the pearl of great price that he was looking for. The astrology itself was kind of incidental. In a very strange way, his whole intellectual career in life up to that point prepared him uniquely for the job of Project Hindsight. His rather than learn Greek by studying the classics, the poems, and the playwrights, he learned Greek with Euclid's Elements. So his specialty was more the technical Greek rather than the literary Greek, and that's the language of the astrological texts. So, and on top of that, the notion of approaching an ancient text on its own terms, having to try to get out of your own worldview, your own unexamined presuppositions, and put yourself in the mind of the people who were writing and reading this text. It's probably not possible to do. And if you did succeed, how would you know that you had succeeded? But the effort to do it is worthwhile. This is one of the things that came out of his education at St. John's. And he'd had a restoration project that he spent at least 10 years of his life working on, and having to do, again, with the lost book of Euclid, with a topic called the porisms. Other authors had referred to this book, and there was enough hints from derivative sources that it restoring this geometrical method of analysis. It was, Newton had his hand at it. A lot of the great mathematicians of the Renaissance had worked on this very issue.
What were they called again?
The porisms.
How do you spell that?
Porisms. It is a way to solve problems that we would use a type of algebra for. But the Greeks really didn't have algebra per se. It's a Arabic invention. There's a parallel in this, in that a mathematician named Francois Viette was the first person to write a theory of astrology. Not astrology. Interesting mix up there. Algebra. The way it's interesting is that algebra and astrology both came to the West by way of the Arabs, and algebra was considered a black art, the same way that magic was, because it was solving problems that the scholastic mathematicians said were unsolvable, theoretically impossible. And then here's this foreign method that put the data in, turn the crank, and out come the answers to unsolvable problems. So algebra was a very mystifying black art to the original the thinkers in the West. But when Viette wrote this book and created the first theory of algebra, he believed that the Greeks did have an algebra, but they just they used the geometrical demonstrations because it was more elegant, and they kind of hid their algebra. You know, it's kind of showing off. So his conviction that there was such a thing as an algebra of the Greeks led him to what he thought he was restoring the algebra of the Greeks, which didn't exist. So he ended up creating modern algebra as a side effect of his attempt to restore something that wasn't there in the first place. Bob had a whole series of mental exercises or things that he'd collectively he writes about them in a proposal called the Institute for the Liberating Arts, and the art of hindsight is one of these. Again, exercises to try to overcome your own unrecognized, unacknowledged assumptions and put yourself in the mindset of the ancients who these things were written for. So in fact, there was actually an earlier Project Hindsight that aimed to translate important works in the history of mathematics that had never been translated. And the same kind of structure, translations by subscription that would be supported by the mathematical community. That was what the Golden Hind Press was founded for, and they did produce a few books. But mathematicians really weren't interested. It's like, you know, what do those old guys know about math that we don't know? You know, they didn't even have a zero. So it really didn't get the support it would have needed. When the same idea was applied to the idea of translating the astrological works, is an entirely different story, because astrologers have always felt that the ancients knew something we didn't, you know, that there's lost lore. I mean, even in Greek times, there, you know, there was the Egyptians was the ancient culture with the esoteric wisdom and knowledge. So astrologers have always had the sense that there was forgotten knowledge. So it was a very exciting concept for astrologers to get behind. But every time Bob would address an audience on any topics that had to do with astrology, he made a point to emphasize from the very beginning to be very insecure in thinking that you know anything at all about ancient astrology. That the things that every time we make some discovery, it generates more questions than it answers. You know, it's and when he'd make speculations on things, he was very clear to separate what he's suggesting as a possible interpretation of something from the things that he could actually say with confidence from the texts themselves. So yeah, that was always stressed, was don't think we know anything at all about this stuff. And that was what really caught my my attention when I spoke with him before the Einstein intensives, because all of a sudden his tone was totally different. It's like, Bill, I got it, you know. And with that dramatic change from his always emphasizing that, you know, we know nothing about this, to I see it. I got it. I just had to come. I flew out from the West Coast for those 4 successive workshops, and I guess that was the summer of 2000. So Ellen told me that spring, Bob came to one day and said, you know, I think the stuff might actually work. And Ellen's reaction was, oh yeah, right. You know, but by the end of the Einstein intensives, which the purpose of which was, now that he saw how all these techniques fit together systematically, the idea was to apply it all to one chart, a chart whose biography we knew very well, Adela Einstein, and you know, see if the stuff actually worked. And by the end of the summer, Ellen was convinced too. It was slow going in one regards, because we had to try everything both in the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac, because at the time that the material is being developed, the two zodiacs were essentially the same. And whatever awareness the founding astrologers would have had of the issue of precision, it wasn't their problem. It's like, well, a couple thousand years ago, they're going to have to figure this out, but they had other things to focus on at the time. And there's still a lot of ongoing debate about tropical versus sidereal. So we had to do all the calculations both ways and to see if we could, discern what worked and what didn't. The answer, by the way, is tropical worked. The only exception to that was the decanic material, the decanates, the 10-degree division of the zodiac that came out of the Egyptian astrology. That just didn't really seem to work consistently either way. If you always have to compare anything you're learning astrology with your own chart first, being the person you know the best. And it's always pretty much a 50-50 split when you're trying to say, well, how many people think the sidereal system better, so on and so forth. One thing I do want to relate in the workshops that was, I think, a brilliant way to get a point across. And that is the point of our own presuppositions and how they affect what we read and understand. This was in the context of dynamical house systems, when we're looking at whole sign houses as the basis of topics, seventh house wife, 10th house career, that sort of thing. Just as the Hindu astrologers do today, the whole sign houses were the ones being used for the topics, but the quadrant houses, the division of the chart based on the midheaven, the midheaven and the ascendant give you 4 quadrants to the house, and since that angle varies over the course of the day rather than being just a nice 90 degrees like you'd like, the Hindus tend to use what we call the porphyry house system, where you just take those quadrants and trisect them, and those give you areas as far as what we speak of cadent or succedent or angular, how strong or how effective is the planet. In the original founding texts ascribed to Hatshepsut and Petasiris, all it says is that planets on angles are strong. And the question of, well, what's on an angle? Is there only strong and not strong? And the working out of the effect of angularity on a planet was finally decided that a 12-fold division, where you have the planets, the first part of the quadrant is the angular or the strong portion, and the middle, the second is the middling, and the last is the weak section, what we still use in astrology today. But instead of having both meanings of the houses combined into one, like modern astrology does, there's again using the whole sign houses for the topical division and the quadrant houses for the angularies, angular, succedent, or cadent. Now, Ptolemy, who was he reformulated astrology based on Aristotelian scientific concepts, and as we learned later on, he was not representative of the early Hellenistic tradition. He apparently, the actual fundamental theoretical framework was pretty much forgotten by his time, and this lack of a cohesive theory led him to reformulate astrology in terms of Aristotelian science, and that had a tremendous influence on astrological history from that point on. A modern analogy is what Dane Rudyard did in the 20th century when he was also looking at what his generation had received in the astrological tradition, and also perceiving a lack of a consistent philosophical framework for it. He reinterpreted astrology based on sort of theosophical ideas. Yeah, Ptolemy was the Rudyard of his day. But anyhow, he gave all of us, or maybe 25 of us in the group, a translation he'd made of a section from Ptolemy where he's describing his version of the dynamical houses. And he gave it to each of us and said, okay, well, follow these instructions, work it out in your chart and Einstein's chart. And all of us were just puzzling over this and trying to figure out what's he talking about? How do you do this? It was just a straightforward set of instructions for dividing the horoscope up for angular, succeeding, or cadent. And none of us could make heads or tails of this. It was, and he waited just the right amount of time before he dropped a hint. He said, oh, by the way, don't assume that it's necessarily going to give you a 12-fold division of the chart. And as soon as, because we all had assumed that, we all had astrological background, and we all assumed that this was going to give us 12 houses. And in fact, it didn't. In fact, it didn't always give the same number of divisions, depending on the conditions of the chart. But as soon as that one unexamined assumption was removed, bingo, all of a sudden it's like it's as clear as day. It's like, oh, of course. And we were able to really easily read it, apply it to our chart, or Einstein's chart, and it was that veil being lifted from our eyes was so immediate and so dramatic that it was hard to remember why it had been difficult. That was such a dramatic demonstration of the problem of unexamined assumptions and how they can totally mess up you're trying to approach a text like that. It was, I'll never forget it. And I think none of us in the class could ever forget that lesson. It was so dramatic to have an incomprehensible text suddenly become crystal clear with just, by the way, don't assume it's going to give you 10 or 12. That was, Bob had a knack for teaching that was unique. He really did have a gift for getting things across in a effective way like that. So that's when I listen back to the Einstein tapes now, recordings now. A lot of the material Bob would have considered obsolete. He is applying sort of modified versions of some of the weighting systems that medieval astrologers used, just for a lack of a way to approach certain problems in actually using the system that he would never have done today. And he also gave a lot more importance to Ptolemy. Well, because Ptolemy is so well represented and so historically significant, but he spends a lot of time on methods that were unique to Ptolemy that he never would have spent that larger proportion of time on the Ptolemaic methods, or he certainly didn't later when he was putting this course together. But these are all things that were learned in the years that followed that. Again, there was another 18, 19 years of research that continued after that point. So, but I always likened that kind of thing. I used to sing in the San Francisco concert chorale, and over the course of a couple seasons, we did all of the Bach motets and amazing polyphonic vocal works. And when you're learning one of these, at first you're just doing it in your section, you know, you're just learning the bass part or the alto part or whatever your voice is. And I likened it to approaching a beautiful Gothic cathedral in a thick fog. You get to a point where you just begin to see the outlines of the building through the haze. And as you get closer, more detail fills in. And at one point you come to a spot where all of a sudden the whole structure and all of its glory is right there in front of you. It just emerges out of the fog. That would be like when we find the first time all four of the sections get together and do a run through, and you get the glory of the piece as it was conceived. I really think Bob had a similar kind of experience in trying to sort out the interconnectedness of all these different material, these concepts, these methods, these techniques, because he had that aha point where all of a sudden, enough of the fog had lifted that you see this thing. I mean, the excitement that he had when I was speaking to him on the phone prior to coming out really had that feel to it of after stumbling in the dark for so long, when you finally get to see the overall structure to where he had 95% of it done at that point. It's just that getting that last 5% of anything, so maybe it took another 10 years to narrow that 5% down to 0.5%. But there's still that last little bit that would take another 10 years to get down to the, so it really was a lot. It took him much longer than he ever thought it would have. And I think if he would have known at the outset how many years of his life this would have taken up, I'm not sure he would have had the heart to continue. The specific set of skills he had, the technical Greek, the experience in approaching ancient texts on their own terms, his experience in trying to restore a system from the remnants of it that other people refer to, all of the specific and unique skills he had that were ideal for dealing with this problem. It's almost like this was his destined life work, because of having this specific experience and knowledge. Probably the number of people in the world that had the same set of skills that could have done justice to the task of restoring Hellenistic astrology, you'd probably be able to count on both hands. But out of those people in the world, the ones that actually had the interest in it and willingness to spend the time on it, it came down to, I think, one person. I don't think there's anybody else that could have done that work, or of the few that could have, that would have been willing to devote that much of their life to it.
For those who are not as familiar with the work, what would you summarize was the impact of this work?
Which work in general? Bob's work on the Hellenistic astrology, or?
I think, yeah, let's start there.
Well, I remember, in the early Hindsight days, they had very ambitious goals of not just doing the Greek texts, but all the surviving Latin texts, the Hebrew texts. There was going to be a Sanskrit tract, because they wanted to attract enough interested scholars to be able to get the entire legacy of astrology translated into modern English. There actually was one book I think one in the Hebrew tract. I never did in the Sanskrit, but anyhow, Bob's, of course, interest was the Greek material, and as the project splintered and everybody went their own way, Project Hindsight narrowed its focus to restoring the Greek stuff, because that was clearly the source of the later material. The medieval stuff was Greek astrology by way of the Persians, by way of the Arabs, and then by way of the Latin West, and then English. So where any one of these stages are worthy of study and interesting. And of course, the total process of sort of the telephone game of seeing how the concept can change over the course of being passed down from different cultures and through different languages. That aspect of it itself is very, very fascinating. But if you were going to just do one of the traditions, it was clear to us, at least, that the Greek was the heart of it all. It was known that the practice of astrology in India was radically transformed by the introduction of the Greek material. It was a book, I think, around 200 AD, translated from Greek into Sanskrit, that made it to India and revolutionized their astrology to where if you get your chart done by an astrologer in New Delhi today, fully 80% of what they do is straight out of the Hellenistic textbook. They have their own earlier strata of lunar astrology, but the Greek astrology is the source of all of that. So, and that material is also the most challenging. The Latin material is recognizably close to modern astrology. It has a lot more techniques and there's a lot more involved, but you recognize it right away as the immediate precursor of our astrology, the astrology of the West, where the Greek stuff was a lot stranger, a lot more foreign. And again, closer to what we see in Hindu astrology today than what we see in Western astrology. And the other problem is that the texts were much more corrupted. There's a lot of important texts that there's only a few surviving manuscripts of. So it's not like some of the important medieval texts where they might have had 20 or 30 copies to compare and do a critical edition to eliminate the scribal errors and things like that. And in fact, there are some important texts that don't survive in the original form at all, but only survive as summaries. So there's a lot of texts that we're aware of but don't have anything but a summary of it or excerpts that other authors quote. The greatest example is that legendary work attributed to the Egyptians, the Chepso Petasiris. It must have been a huge book, and I don't think anybody had the money to make a copy of the whole thing. I think the only copy that existed was the one in the library in Alexandria. So that is lost and gone forever unless somebody buried a copy in the little treasure box at the foot of the Sphinx that we hear about. That would be really something if that were to show up. But through a marvelous coincidence, enough material survives in the various different authors that the system is all there. It's recognized, but it's like, a jar that's fallen into the ground and broken into 100 pieces. The pieces are all there, and it's a painstaking task to put them all together again. But it's all there. It's just you don't have the convenience of Guido Bonatti or somebody like that who writes a masterful volume that has everything you need to know from one author and one source. So you're not having to deal with differences in style, differences in, well, that's the other thing. There's compositional techniques that are used in the ancient authors that were understood and commonplace in their day that we're not familiar with and not used to, that you have to, first of all, know about, and then and know how to translate that in a way that makes sense to a modern person. When they're doing delineations, they always give the most extreme cases of it to better show the principles involved. But when you read it, the delineation from these ancient texts sounds like it's all really very ghastly, But that's because, again, they're describing the extreme cases of things with the understanding that in practice, there's a whole spectrum of how it's going to materialize. But rather than try to give a moderate interpretation, he gives the extremes so that you can see the principles involved. And then there are some things that were deliberately written in esoteric fashion to where you have to have a key to translate it, in a case where somebody's trying to make sure that esoteric knowledge doesn't fall into the wrong hands. That was not an uncommon way to write some of these books. That continued up into the medieval era because of problems of persecution from the church. You wouldn't want to step on any of the toes of the areas that the church considered to be their domain. So you could write a text in such a way that it had a surface meaning that a person could read and get something from, and not even realize that they weren't getting the depth, because you had to have a key, an interpretive key, which was passed on orally from teacher to student, so that these materials could be understood by initiates. So that's always a possibility that has to be considered in an old text, is that there's an intentional obscuring of the juicier stuff.
Or if you want Indiana Jones to be able to understand your message.
Right. And other little shortcuts, like where in a modern astrological book, we'll write everything out in painful detail, what this planet means in this sign, go through all 12 signs, what this planet means in this house, go through all 12 houses, and so on and so forth, where an ancient writer will find a way to kind of compress things. To give an example of a planet in this sign, and you see enough of how the interaction works that as long as you know the whole structure, you can work the rest out for yourself. I mean, I've got that sense in my earlier days of reading astrology books. It wasn't long as I'm going through things that I see the formula that the author's using in terms of interpreting aspects or planets and signs and houses. And so it's in days when books had to be copied by hand and paper wasn't cheap, it makes a lot of sense to have these data compression techniques that they would use. But again, all this stuff, if you're unfamiliar with it, it just makes it, you can't just sit down and pick these books up and read through them and say, oh yeah. I mean, I really remember that as a subscriber in the early days, the medieval stuff, no problem. I mean, it was very accessible, but the Greek stuff was weird. And the other problem is that the language, the vocabulary, and this was another thing that Bob's experience in philosophy helped with, because when the Greeks developed their philosophical vocabulary, their technical vocabulary for philosophy, they did it in a very specific way, taking words that had concrete meanings in ordinary Greek, and they would develop the philosophical usage of it in a consistent way. And Bob found that they were doing the same thing with the technical vocabulary for astrology. So his experience in Greek word formation and all of these things that he learned through the course of studying the philosophical writings came immediately important in dealing with the Greek stuff, because you'll have the case of looking up a word, and even in the best Greek language, what's the word for a dictionary? I don't know. Anyhow, the definitions are only as good as the understanding of the person who wrote them. And if the person who wrote them doesn't have a knowledge of the ancient astrology, how can they write a useful definition? And a lot of these words, the only instance of them known in Greek were in astrological writings. So the lexicons are really only useful to a certain point. When you have a word that became an astrological technical term that's not used elsewhere in Greek, he had to be able to use the same kind of reasoning, find the roots of the words, what their concrete meanings were. And in often cases, you'd find a word that could have an astronomical meaning that was parallel to the astrological meaning somehow. It would take Bob a whole lecture to explain this. He's got a lot of lectures where he does do that. But finding the meaning of these technical terms was a real challenge, and he was very concerned with having a consistent vocabulary, because astrological terminology as it is there isn't any consistency to it. It's all inherited from other languages. We have some words that are just straight transliterations of a foreign word, and like our words for aspects, where we can have a opposition, a square, a trine, a sextile. Those four words are all coming from different roots. They don't. So he was trying, when he was developing a standardized vocabulary from the Greek to the English, to make sure that they were all semantically consistent. And wherever possible, he tried to stick with, to avoid Latin roots and stick with the roots, actual English words. So he would sometimes he would think about a given word. He might spend 2 weeks trying to decide the best English translation for a given word. Because you see this problem you'd have a word in Greek that has a range of meanings, and it gets translated into Latin. You find the translator in those days would find the Latin word that came closest to the Greek word, to where their circles of meaning overlap enough. I mean, there'd be some meanings in the Greek that weren't inherent in the Latin word, and the other way. It was very rare to find two words where the semantic fields overlap exactly. So you find the words where the semantic fields overlap as much as possible, but you'll still have a meaning in one language that doesn't exist in the semantic field of the language of the other language. So all fine and good as long as you stay in Latin, but then when you translate the Latin word into English, you have the same problem. You have not a complete correspondence in the semantic field, but you find the two words with the best overlap. But then you end up with a word whose semantic field has no contact at all with the semantic field in Greek. So it becomes strictly nominalistic. We take it as a technical word, and we don't think about why that word was chosen. Well, Bob was all about thinking about why a word was chosen, and there's no way to really get to the heart of the system without doing that. The words that the astrologers chose for their technical vocabulary encoded a lot of the concepts. So a lot of the concepts can only really be fully restored through the reasoning process excuse me, that was used in developing that specific vocabulary.
So I speak a number of languages, and I've actually worked in translating and more so interpreting. And maybe a more specific, maybe a real life example would be, because Bob was a lot about culture, right? The timeline and the culture that people lived in that gives them their their life experiences, right? Shapes how they're thinking, feeling, and so forth. And so you could have, just like, take, for example, I say to you the color blue, and you lived on the West Coast, perhaps next to the ocean, and blue strikes in your memory, your mind, the color, maybe an azure or maybe a gray blue, whereas I grew up in the Midwest. Well, we do have a lot of lakes here, but lake blue is different, or the sky can look very different, which we typically refer to the sky or water as a color of blue. But because we grew up in or lived in very different areas, just that, by saying, well, he wore a blue shirt that day, or she had blue eyes, could be totally different from our own perspectives and in what we think of. So it's the same word technically, but because of our own experiences can be very, very different.
Yep.
I was wondering, so I'd like to kind of paint a picture for people who maybe, there are a lot of people who have heard about Bob, but have learned from students of his since. And so have only really heard of him in passing, but don't really know the history, and including me. And so I'd like to clarify a few things if you'd help me out with this. So even just a timeline. I know a bit about, Bob actually grew up in Minnesota, but just like a quick timeline. And I mean, how does someone who was into philosophy and mathematics stumble in supposedly seemingly into astrology? Yeah, so just a quick overview would be great.
Sure. Well, his father was also a school teacher at some time, and he was a whiz kid at school. He was not only a straight A student, but he was a 3-sport athletic star, and he had a full scholarship to MIT when he was figured he was going to be following this mathematical physics career line. And somehow he found out about the Great Books program at St. John's in Annapolis, and it sounded like what he wanted to do. Unfortunately, they don't have scholarships or financial aid or anything, and his family was, school teachers aren't the wealthiest people, but his dad, said, "We'll find a way, son." So he gave up that free ride to a prestigious science school to take a different path. And he had a couple of teachers there that really had a profound influence on him, Jacob Klein being one, and Tom McDonald another. But under their influence, I think it was Klein who urged him not to study philosophy. You don't want to end up as a philosophy teacher in college somewhere. You want to read the books, preferably in the original tongue, and think about them. Not be someone who's going to be teaching stuff secondhand, but learn to think yourself. And Bob is the only person I've really known that I would call a philosopher, as opposed to, a teacher of philosophy or a student of philosophy. He did original work in the field. He had his own
What would you say distinguishes a person between being a student or a teacher as opposed to a practicer?
Well, again, if you can do original work in the field, if you can actually philosophize as opposed to explain what other philosophers have done, that's really the difference. Are you teaching it or are you doing it? You take something that you learned from your teacher and as a starting point, and then you might end up, like Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle ended up with his own school. He kind of repudiated a lot of the things that you learned from Plato, never in disrespect, but to him, he was taking the next step up, learning and continuing the work as opposed to preserving the work. I'm doing my best to preserve the work that Bob has done, particularly the unpublished work. He really did die too soon. And I just don't want to see his life's work end up in boxes stashed away somewhere without being accessible to people. There is some remarkable work he's done and some remarkable discoveries that both he and Ellen have made that have importance and repercussions far outside just the field of astrology. Like Bob did find the pearl of great price he was looking for in the philosophy underlying this. And it would just be a shame if it got lost, you know. Like the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, when it gets packed up in a box and stuck away in the government warehouse somewhere, where presumably it's still stayed in a collected mess. You know?
Good reference.
Now, I've always been attracted to philosophical subjects, and I've read a lot of philosophical works, but I do not have the capacity to be a philosopher. I don't have that in my. Maybe that's one reason why it's so attractive to me, is that it's a deficit of mine. I mean, I forget which of the modern philosophers said, you know, the first thing you have to consider is, why is there something rather than nothing? You know, first time I came across that, I think I was short-circuited for about 2 days. You know? It's not the kind of thing that I can seriously attack a question like that and expect to come up with an original answer that's meaningful to anybody at all. So that's why it was such a blessing to me to end up with a teacher like Bob, because he was a natural at from the very first time I heard him lecture at that first phase conclave. During the daytime stuff, there'd be more of the presentation of technical things, but in the evening, he kind of branched out on the related philosophical stuff. And as long as there was still one person left in the audience willing to listen, he'd be willing to keep talking. You know, he'd have his whiteboard and a marker, and you know, no books, no notes, no nothing, and he'd just go on and on and on. And when you'd walk out of a Schmidt's lecture, and I was in no way unique in this way, this was the common reaction. It was not, first of all, you're jazzed, you know, you got a lot of stuff going through your mind, but when you walk out, it's not Bob's ideas going around in your mind. It's Bob would stimulate my own thinking. I mean, we'd all be walking out after a lecture and we'd all be on our own little clouds. But again, it wasn't just his words going around in our heads. It was the thoughts of our own that had been stimulated by what he said. And that's what made it so exciting and so unique too, and useful. Like every one of us is in our own little thought space, but we're all inspired to a similar level of having our latent ability to think, you know, jazzed up some. So and he never, we've got, I don't know if you got it on the website, but that lecture he gave at a neo-astrology conference that Michael Earlywine put on. I know I sent you the tape of it. That was his first lecture he'd ever given. He didn't really know he had an aptitude for that. That's how he got into the astrology, by the way, is he had met Michael Earlywine at who was the founder of Matrix software. He wrote a book on programming, computer programming for astrologers that allowed me to write my first astrology program. But he is also into form of Buddhism. He has a center up there where he's in Michigan, I think. But he and Bob had an accidental meeting where they just really had a really good conversation and stimulated each other's thinking quite a bit, to the point where Bob, who was kind of in transition at the time, I think he'd been living in the Northwest, he moved his stuff out there to I think it's Michigan. Anyhow, he got hired by Michael's company to write a module for their software, a research module to see if the principles of chaos theory could in any way be used to validate or explain astrology. That was one of his criticisms, is how people kind of want to jump on board with whatever the latest bandwagon is in some new field. And anyhow, if you haven't heard the lecture that he gave on it, it was on exactly that. What are the possible applications of astrology to chaos theory? And so he was hired to actually write or do the mathematics that could be turned into the software for a research module for chaos theory and astrology. So
What was he doing before that, just for some reference?
well, he'd always taken blue collar jobs that he could, so he wouldn't have to think about it when he got home. You know, he worked at the print shop of St. John's when he left college. I think he had a couple of printing jobs. In Seattle, I think he was working at a marine supply store or something. Something that he could do and not have it, not take it home with him, you know, so that in his off hours, he could do what he liked to do best, which is just sit and think about something. You know, like I said, when he was thinking about the porisms, so trying to restore the method of the porisms. That just took a lot of sustained thought over about a 10-year period, and he finally did it. You know, he in this the early hindsight journal, there's an article where he discusses it. Now, if he would have done that, if he would have been a contemporary of Newton's, you know, he'd be in the history books today. You know, there'd be a chair of mathematics in his name somewhere, because that was such a that was one of those holy grail issues in those days. But he also had the misfortune of getting interested in subjects that no one else cared about anymore. So
was he involved in astrology at all at that point, or was that how he kind of got his toe?
Not at all.
Okay.
How he got involved was to this project of doing the math to the computer software that would apply principles of chaos theory to I guess it was looking at trying to find a verifiable empirical basis, like what people do with statistics, trying to use statistics to verify astrology. There's been a lot of work of that. In those days, there was a lot of interest in finding a scientific basis for astrology. Bob has a number of lectures about the shortcomings of all of those efforts and some of the outright folly of some of them, and then he proposes his theoretical his ideas about what he would do if he was tackling that problem.
So he happened to know these ancient languages, and he happens to be working on this computer programming project, and happens to be getting into astrology.
Yeah, being involved in Michael Earlywin's circle there, since it's an astrology company, it writes astrology software. So he ended up going to some conferences, I guess, running a trade show booth like he was for Hindsight at Norwalk in '94. And it was I think it was at the UAC, which is there are three big professional organizations of astrologers. And they used to have their own annual conferences, but having them, some of them, like NCGR still has its own conference, but at one point they formed the United Astrology Congress. So the three organizations would put a big conference together. I think it's every 3 years they have one of these. So it was at the UAC, it must have been right before that, like '92, that what happens is Robert Zoller, who's a medievalist, he was frustrated by this huge body of works in Latin, astrological work in Latin that has never been translated. So he took a course in Latin at I think New York City College and started. He was really the instigator of this whole movement of getting back, just getting the ancient texts available again. So he had started doing his own translations from the Latin, and so he and Rob Hand and Bob Schmidt at this NORWAC, when they were talking about the idea of retrieval of these ancient texts, and when I think when Bob Hand found out that Rob knew Greek, it was like, you do? So the three of them came up with this notion of a translation project. Zoller was doing the Latin translations, Bob was doing the Greek translations. Rob Hand was supposedly the promoter, the person of note in the astrological world that could let people know about it and attract attention to the whole thing. So it's the three Robites: Robert Zoller, Robert Hand, and Robert Schmidt. So that's how we got into it. Was he knew Greek, and I think Ptolemy was the first thing he worked on, and it's compared to some of the writers who were really colloquial in the writing, like the most important source for the techniques is Vedius Valens, but he's writing in a very homey style. It's actually letters to his brothers, what they started out as. Or Ptolemy, on the other hand, is this. Well, he's one of the leading intellects of his day. He's as well as an astronomer. He's a natural scientist of great repute. So his writing is much more stylized. Bob once described it as his ideal would be for a work to be one single sentence made out of nested clauses. You'd have to get to the very center clause of this huge sentence to be able to indulge. Anyhow, it's a very stylistic and difficult form of Greek. And Bob likes hard stuff, he likes difficult stuff. So that was fun for him just to dive into that. But then again, as he gets into the other texts, with having to deal with all the problems I was speaking of a limited number of texts to be able to compare for a critical edition, and texts that are incomplete, or anyhow, it's not. It's a very difficult endeavor, and again, Bob he liked the hard stuff. He was attracted to things he didn't mind if it took a long time to do something. As long as he could make progress, he'd keep working at it. So
is it safe to say that in the 90s, a lot of that translating and research was done? Well, and then in the late 90s and then the early 2000s was kind of that aha moment and presenting?
1994 was when they started. By the time that I met them in 94, 93 is when it started. By the 94 NORWAC, I think there were 2 Latin works out, and not very many more of the Greek. They had really just gotten started. So the bulk of these, and these were done as preliminary translations. He knew that it was not possible to sit down and do a definitive translation of any one of these works from the outset because of the vocabulary problem, because of the conceptual difficulties. So the idea was to crank them out pretty quickly to try to do a unit of translation, which these were, they had a risograph, so they print these themselves and do stapled booklets. I think I have one around here somewhere. I can show you, but the idea was to try to do one a month as provisional translations, get them into people's hands so astrologers can start reading them and get feedback from them that could be used for the final version, and maybe get more people interested in the idea of learning Latin or Greek and try their own hand at it. It really was this idealistic idea behind it from the outset. So,
And then there was enough by the late 90s, early 2000s where they're presenting these conclaves and so forth. And especially it sounds like the Einstein intensives, well, shortly before that, when Bob says to Ellen, I think this actually works, it sounds like that was really a turning point.
yeah, yeah. Because again, it wasn't anything he really thought about either way. But I think if he would have asked his opinion in the early days, I think if he had to choose yes or no, he probably would have been more on the it probably doesn't work side. But that was his concern at all. Yeah. But see, there are a lot of things in the history of science, which was Bob's big interest, that just like the purisms, this restoration problem, there were issues that were of great import in the scholastic era and the early Renaissance that a lot of people were working on, and one of them, which was one of Bob's little pet things, was how you quantify a variation quality. That was a big issue for the scientists in the Renaissance. How do you? I mean, it's easy enough to deal with the quantitative variation in something, but something that changes in intensity but doesn't change what it is. How to mathematize that was a big project in those days. And in the astrology, you see actual worked examples of it, because that's a place where you need a practical application of that. If you're trying to look at how a planet varies in its effects depending on whether it's angular or succedent, whether it's of the sect or not of the sect, there's all kinds of situations where you need to be able to judge how different factors change the quality of a planet's action. So you have practical worked examples of things that otherwise are just talked about in theoretical texts. Like there'd be texts with titles like on the intensification and relaxation of forms. Well, that's exactly what this is talking about. I mean, but if you're reading a scholastic text on the thing, that's one thing. But when you look at an astrological text and you see worked examples of that applied concept in how you account for the variation of a planet's strength depending on what planets it's being aspect with, what house it's in, it was a real treasure trove from that point of view of the scientific issues of the day, because astrology was a meta science. It was a very high science in its day. It was I mean, you couldn't be a physician for one thing without having learned astrology. It did not have the same status in society that it has today.
Yeah.
So
well, speaking of that qualitative aspect, so if we're looking at a lot of what we have currently on the site, it sounds like it's that early recorded works, the conclaves. But it sounds like from what you're saying, because you've been around for so many years around the work, is that qualitatively there was a lot that came out afterwards, and that, like you said, even when you're doing the Einstein intensives, had if today Bob were doing those classes, it sounds like he would do them differently. And so it's kind of a two-part question. So let's say pre the findings of the Einstein intensives, what kind of impact did these findings have? Because it sounds like there were a lot of experienced astrologers in the room. Well, maybe I should clarify that, because it sounds like some people were also linguists, but mostly astrology.
There's a really wide range of skills that were represented by the people involved in Project Hindsight. People coming to the conclaves, the one common interest was astrology, but we had people who were into computer science or Babylonian languages or
Wow.
really quite a remarkable range of skills and interests, and astrology was the one unifying thing. But from the very beginning, like that first conclave, they had not, I mean, they barely scratched the surface, but they'd already found things that were causing great excitement. And like I said, for me, the issue of house division, because it was a huge problem for me, particularly, like I said, when astrologers is going to learn a new technique, the first thing they have to do is apply it to their own chart. If you can't make it work in your own chart, you can't use it. And the way my chart is, with all the planets bundled together in a very small place around the IC, if you take the 10 top house systems in use, no two of them give exactly the same placement. No two, I mean, so it was early on when I'm becoming aware of this, I thought, well, here, this is obviously my assignment, and is to figure out which one of these house systems works, you know. Because if I know myself well enough and I know what it means to have a planet in a given house, well, by gosh and by golly, there's only one that should work, right? And I went around in circles for 20 years on that question.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I was aware of the whole sign houses as they're used in Hindu astrology, because the interest in Hindu astrology in the West was coming along around the same time. In James Braha's book, was out in the early 90s, and so that was one of the parallel streams in the astrological world. So I mean, I always kind of envied the Hindus in that they knew where their house cusps were, but on the other hand, they didn't know where zero Aries was. The difference in how you define the sidereal zodiac. So there's pluses and minuses. But anyhow, I never stopped and considered the whole sign house system because it was foreign. It was not part, you know, that was one of Rudyard's injunctions, is don't mix your frames of reference, you know, don't take something out of a wrong context. When I found out that that was actually the original house system in the West, and that the Hindus got it from us, you know, and all of a sudden it was okay. It was a valid choice. I mean, I was kind of flabbergasted when I looked at my own chart, because I'd given up on finding a house system and that was hugely limiting to me as an astrologer, because if you can't use planets and houses specifically as a technique, that's half the game right there, you know.
Yeah.
I could use planets and quadrants, because we knew where the quadrants were, but anyhow, so it was extremely exciting for me when I looked at my own chart, and it took me all of about 5 minutes to be like, oh my God, here it is. I found it. Here we go.
And you said you'd been searching for 20 years. So you'd been studying at least 20 years of astrology at that point. At what age were you in, if I may ask, when you met Bob?
Well,
roughly.
94, I would have been 30, 39, I guess.
And so what would you say your previous history in studying astrology? What quote brands of astrology had you been studying?
Well, my girlfriend, when I was 19, gave me my first astrology book. It was The Complete Astrologer by the Parkers, Derek and Julia Parker. So it used equal houses because they're British, and that was the standard system there. And I still remember I still somewhere have my first chart. You can tell it was drawn by a Virgo, you know, straight lines, colored pencils. And I did all of my circle of friends. And that was interesting too, because it's something like 8 out of 10 of my circle were all had Libra moons. So that was something.
Oh, wow.
Libra moons flocked together. That was when I was 19. And I think my second astrology book was Rudyard, Lunation Cycle, and that set me on a track there. So I was very much impressed by Rudyard's work. And let's see, who are some of the other biggies? Well, mainly it was just the experience of doing a lot of charts. And I had a few aspectarians that I used because that was something that always worked. That aspects, people, planets were very reliable as a something you could delineate. But
So you
like,
had a lot of practical application, it sounds like you're saying.
but like so many of my enthusiasms, it's not something that I did, you know, full time all the time. I go in phases and, you know, study something for a while and then I kind of slack off on it. Uh, but uh, but that one nagging question of houses, because it's interesting in that when I did my first chart using the Parker's book, with equal houses, there was something I read in, you know, when we're going through and putting together an interpretation from the cookbook material they provided. It spoke to an estrangement with my father. And at the time, that was literally true. And it, as a result of that, I picked up the phone and called my dad. And we had, I ran away from home at age 16 over a hair length argument, if you can believe that, but that was the day, you know, that was what thing, letting your freak flag fly was important to us in those days, to our tribal identification. But he was overjoyed to hear from me, and you know, the breach was immediately healed, and never again did we have any kind of. I mean, I was close to him for the rest of my life till his death.
Wow.
So just that one thing that astrology gave me, if I never got another thing from astrology, it's still worth every penny for every book, every minute I've ever spent studying it. The personal payoff just in that one case justifies it to me.
That's great.
But I had just come to, I had a friend who could tell what people's sun signs were. You know, we'd be in the line in a supermarket and you say, the cashier, she's a Sag. And, you know, I was, of course, a skeptic when I was young with all the various prejudices that were instilled with as, when we grow up about pseudosciences and things like that. But anytime he ventured that, if, you know, yeah, I get to the cashier and say, excuse me, are you a Sag? Well, yes, how did you know? Yeah, he was never wrong. It's just and if you put him to the test, they say, okay, well, what's he? You might have to observe and think about it for a few minutes, but he'd narrow it down to one of two. And his first choice was right half the time. But if it was wrong, the second choice was it. And this is if you put him on the spot. It never took him more than two guesses. And to me, that, you know, was something I couldn't ignore. It's like, there's something here. If he can tell what a person's sun sign is by observation, then I can't just ignore this thing.
Yeah.
And by then I traveled enough and had enough experience of meeting someone on the opposite coast that so much reminded me of someone else in their appearance, their mannerisms, and yet there was no way that they were related. I'd already come to feel that there were a finite number of human types. And so the idea, astrology, being such a rich system of typology. I mean, you look at Myers-Briggs, what do you have? You got 4 things that give you 16 varieties. You know, astrology is such a rich form of psychological description that there's nothing like it. So anyhow, I was right for looking into it, and very early on I decided that there was certainly something there, and I also decided that I'd never met anybody who really knew what they were talking about. So that if I wanted to know anything about astrology, I'd have to study it myself, which is why I did so.
So it sounds like that, I mean, years later, meeting Bob and the crew, that they really impressed you. Like there's something really significant. And is it possible to even quantify how much your your understanding or your application of astrology improved after that 2000 era and the Einstein intensives, and then afterwards, because it sounds like there's a lot of content that few people actually have had access to, that's taking it what degree beyond that?
It caused a problem for me in that at some point I just had to stop doing astrology, because I had the way I'd always done astrology, and it was still worthwhile, but I'm learning this new stuff, but I have to compartmentalize myself and put that aside and stick with what I knew if I was actually doing a reading. And it just got increasingly difficult. So I stopped doing readings entirely so I could focus, because the problem is that the new old stuff wasn't really ready to be used yet. But see, just like the houses was a huge breakthrough for me. I could all of a sudden use houses in my reading. It took me a while to actually have the confidence to apply whole sign houses in all cases. And as it is now, I understand why it doesn't work in all cases. If someone is in the last few degrees of a sign, it's not as simple as all that. And of course, Bob never said it was simple as all that. He just said, well, take a look at it. That's all. I was kind of had an evangelistic fervor about whole signs for a while that I would have to modify now. But the thing is, just like that was huge for me. One of the very first things that came out was the issue of sect, was the issue of a day chart versus a night chart, and that a planet belongs to one of the two sects and acts differently, whether it's in a chart of that sect or not. That was a huge thing for everybody. Just a few of these that just on the very top of the barrel, the issue of sect alone opened huge vistas for a large number of people.
So this was not a concept previous to these translations.
Yeah, it was a technique or a concept that had been completely lost in astrology. And it's simple and easy to apply and very basic, but the implications of it are huge. So that's why there was so much initial excitement. Again, people like me that got on the whole sign house bandwagon, and just the issue of sect. That was Rob Hand's first thing he wrote based on hindsight material. So he wrote a little pamphlet called Sect Day and Night. And so even though there wasn't a lot of material done yet, just from the little bit that they'd done, it was having a huge impact, a huge effect. It wasn't long before I couldn't read an issue of Mountain Astrologer without finding concepts and terms that were completely unknown before 1994, and they'd gotten assimilated and absorbed into the astrological world in a short time because they were so powerful. So and that's why it didn't matter that there were so few books done at that first conclave. And the second conclave, in between that time, is when they discovered the Time Lord methods that were in Valence. And that was always the big advantage that the Hindu astrologers had over the Western astrologers was their ability to predict based on the dashas, the dasha system. And to find out that Western astrology had their own equivalent timing method was another huge thing. So the second phase conclave, we had N.K. Rao, very well-regarded and famous astrologers from India came over. We had a whole contingent of Vedic astrologers, because seeing the relationship, one, that the Greek material had made it to India and had been preserved because India never did throw out the astrology tradition. It's been constant to this day. they still use it. Educated Indians still use it for choosing their children's future spouses. You know, they still do arranged marriages and things there. It's still an important part of the culture, even amongst university educated professionals. So we had a chance to see a living tradition and the ability to look at the Greek material that was so foreign to us and find a contemporary example of a descendant of it still alive. That was a big thing. So that was one of the main themes of the Second Phase Conclave was, you know, the East meets West kind of thing. So that was, I think it's book 4 in Valence is when they first, so they're in the second year and they're, you know, again, a whole nother layer of marvelous stuff is uncovered. And that's why the, you know, just the treasures kept coming, and it really more and more people were convinced of the value of this stuff because there were things you could put to use right away.
Is it possible to even quantify? I mean, you mentioned that the Greek texts were kind of like shattered pieces of a vase, and you know there are only certain ones remaining. Are we able to quantify how many there are existing and how many Bob was able to translate?
Quantifying how many is existing that are known is pretty easy. A group of scholars under the impetus of one man, it was Kumant, one of the early scholars, started a project of collecting, cataloging all the surviving manuscripts in universities and monasteries and private collections, whatever. And that's the CCAG, the catalog of Greek astrological texts. That project got started in the late 19th century and didn't complete till about 1950. So there's all these volumes of these texts, and of course they're just sitting collecting dust in libraries. But that's where the text that Bob, I just went to interlibrary alone and checked them out one at a time, you know, made his photocopies. So the texts are there, and someone else had done the critical editions. That's a whole art in itself, taking you know, the handwritten documents and, you know, getting all the known copies of one document, comparing them, sorting out what, you know, finding the errors, so making the best possible edition out of them, and then putting it in print instead of handwritten script. That's a huge job in itself, but a whole earlier generation of scholars did all that work and just left the material then collecting dust in libraries until Project Hindsight came along and started actually translating these things. So there was, let's see, James Holden had done some work on his own, an independent scholar who translates some Greek stuff. But I think he I don't know if he was publishing the early stuff. He was just kind of circulating amongst friends. I know there's some stuff out now, but trying to think of who else. No one was really doing the Greek material. It's just pretty much ignored, or people not even aware of it. But to have, oh, let's see, the other thing was the part of fortune is one of those kind of like the appendix or something that we still have, but nobody really bothers with them anymore. I remember learning how to calculate the part of fortune, or the lot of fortune as they called it, and, you know, dutifully marking it in every chart I drew, but no one knew what to do with the darn thing. You know, it was just this traditional piece of leftover something or other, you know. And to find out that it's part of a whole doctrine, that first of all, that most people calculate it differently by night than by day. That was big news. And that it's opposite, it's a part of spirit, and that there's one for all the other planets, that there's 7 of the slots, not just one of them. That actually, it was Zoller who was one of the first ones to be intrigued by what they called the Arabic parts, because they didn't realize that they were Greek, because they survived in the Arabic material. So Rob Zoller had written a book on the parts, the Arabic parts, before Project Hindsight. So that was another big piece of news, was that not only are you calculating it wrong in half the charts you do, but it actually has meaning and significance and value. You know?
Was that when zodiacal releasing was, does it related to zodiacal releasing that you're talking about?
The zodiacal releasing starts from either the part of fortune, the lot of fortune, or the lot of spirit. So
was it known about before Rob's work?
no. In fact, it's interesting. I'll see on the internet somebody describing the course that they're going to teach, and it's Bob's work from beginning to end. The language, like the name zodiacal releasing from spirit. Bob had to coin that name because there was no name given to it. The description of that technique comes from Valens in one spot, and it's very bare bones. When you read what Valens says about it, and you compare that with what you can get on the internet in the description of this marvelous technique, and breaks the life down into chapters and stages, and that's all Bob's vocabulary.
So you're saying that even the definitions, the descriptions, are something that Bob had to come up with.
That's all his work. And in fact, a lot of us, we had work sessions here over the course of the year where a number of people contributed to the effort in terms of doing background work. But all of the description of the technique, I mean, literally verbatim, the language that I'm seeing reflected in people's advertisements is all verbatim Bob. I mean, I produced the CD that we distributed on zodiacal releasing, and see in Valens's book, he gives a curse, a blessing and a curse. He says that anybody, anything you learn from your teacher, you need to make sure and acknowledge your teacher. It's like I could read it directly, but it's like, acknowledge your source and do honor to the person who taught you something. So we made a point when we released that zodiacal releasing workshop to give Valens credit and to repeat his little blessing and curse. Like, if you do this, may all good things happen to you, but if you don't, may the opposite happen. We felt it important to follow Valens's own injunction, and so it's discouraging to see. Not only is Bob's work not acknowledged, but it's not even said that it came from Valens. This is a text from some old Greek text. It's like, since you got everything else word to word from the workshop that we produced, couldn't you at least give Valens credit as a source of this? It's like,
did Rob make his own translation of Valens, or did he use
he used his own?
So he made a point of translating based upon his experience. So I'm sure, like you said, the earlier, so kind of just thinking like a linguist here, I could understand why he would quickly, do those quick books. I forgot what you called them.
Translations.
And so kind of then just get initially through them and then compare, is this terminology similar? Are we seeing similarities? And then later go in deeper. And then you had mentioned he was so emphatic about, we need to presume that we set aside any presumptions, about how things were, who these people were, and so forth. And so therefore making his own translation of Valens could come up with some very different information.
Yeah.
But so speaking of the translations, again, are we able to quantify how much of that work of the Greek books that he did end up translating?
Yeah, I'd say I could give you a more exact figure by the time that we talk again, but I'd
Mhm.
say probably somewhere around 80% of the surviving material.
That's really significant.
Yeah.
And so let's take the works of Vedic balance. So you can get other translations. Was it ever a part of, did anyone ever find it curious to go to other translations and compare Bob's to those
So
others?
there's only one other translation, and I think it was done after Bob. So there's some partial translations, but no, there's not a and you know, it's kind of disheartening, but there are translations that have been done um, that don't acknowledge their dependence on Bob's earlier translation,
Hmm.
to the point like there'll be a word that Bob probably spent 2 weeks off and on thinking about before he finally came up with an English word he was satisfied for. And then another person does a translation with no reference to Bob's translation, and yet they use this word as something that they looked up in the lexicon.
Hmm.
Or even um, replicating things that he later decided were mistakes, copying his mistake without giving credit to Bob. It's really disheartening to see how much that has happened. A part of it is just people have a notion that astrology is all this ancient stuff and it's all based in public domain because it's been around for thousands of years anyhow, without realizing that that's not really the case. And especially in the case of vernacular music, a completely unknown technique that Bob unearthed out of Valens. And it's the amount of material in Valens is, I mean, it's pretty interesting because we included the translation of every word that Valens has to say on the subject. And if you look at, that was what Bob had to start with, and you look at what the results of maybe 2 years of work on applying this on a bunch of different charts, on looking at an action of all of the richness of that material, none of that is obvious from reading Valens. It all came out of the work of a number of people under Bob's direction. I mean, I was one of the, I've got recordings of all of the work sessions. I could tell you who was involved and who did what, but the bulk of the work was Bob and Ellen. And all the conceptual work was Bob. And it's spreading around because it's so useful and powerful, but no one bothers to acknowledge who did the work, as if it just sort of existed like that, and somebody managed to find out his old Greek text and pass it around. People don't realize how much work goes into this. And that really represents 2 years of work, pretty much full-time work on that one technique. So to not even have the decency to acknowledge the source, let alone send a contribution to help support his widow, it's discouraging.
Well, obviously, me and you are on a different mission, and John included. And I think a fun note to end on might be for today would be, what are some of the philosophical contributions that have most amazed or impacted or got your brain going? Like you said, Bob the philosopher, not the teacher, regurgitator.
Well, I really like all that I've learned about Plato's cosmology from Bob. I think that's for me personally, it's very compatible with my spirituality. I find it very, very fascinating and also intellectually rewarding. But I also like the kind of modified stoicism that you see in Valens, that basically says we all have a destiny. We have a destiny, and that predetermined, but how we get there is not. And it's all about the journey. The destination for all of us is the same, 6 feet under, right? But how we get there and the nature of the voyage from here to there is a result of the decisions we make, the choices we make. Even if on one hand, the outcome is going to be the same. it makes a whole lot of difference. Whether you have a lousy voyage on the way to a good end, or whether you have a great voyage on the way to whatever kind of end. So that was interesting, an interesting variation on the Stoic idea that, you know, it's all predetermined, you know, the fate rules everything. The complexity and the nuances in the ancient concepts of fate was a real pleasure to learn. So that's a big one.
So fate has a lot to do with it, the journey, the destination, what happens in between.
Right. That well, the destination might be preordained, like it might be preordained that I never have children, but why I never have children, the way I reach the state of childless is not necessarily predetermined. It's a choice, maybe it's an accident, maybe, who knows, but the idea that even though the outcome is set, that the nature of the voyage between here and there is not, and that my choices can make all the difference in the quality of my life, even if we do have that one level of fate. That's a nice way to look at things.
So maybe on that note, if you had been at that NORWAC conference and you had passed by the Project Hindsight table, how do you think your life would have been different?
Hard to say. I'd like to think I would have heard about it at some point, but I certainly would have missed that first phase conclave, and that was for me a life-changing event. So I'm glad.
Well, it sounds like by your definition, you would have been destined to meet them, but just in a different way, maybe at a different time.
Yeah, and I would have had to just hear about that first phase conclave and listen to the tapes and see the pictures without having actually been there. And I'm glad I was there.
Can you recall, was there anything specific about that conclave, or was it just generally the experience that was just mind-blowing? And like you said, how Bob had a way of teaching and getting your brain to open up about or think about other things?
All of the above. The nighttime lectures that were so stimulating was probably my favorite single part of it. But the you know, just being around a bunch of other people who were also excited and having their minds opened and learning new material, and it was a big party, but with real meat in the diet.
What is your hope for this work that still remains to be published and is out there? What is your hope for it?
Well, that it gets published, for one thing. It, you know, finds its way into libraries and people's consciousnesses, so it's available for you know, future generations. It's not just lost.
Because it was lost once before, it sounds like.
Well, the